Hi, this is Christopher Perrin, and welcome to this episode of The Christopher Perrin Show. In this episode, I'd like to talk about rigor and rest in education. You know, there's a tendency among human beings to move from, one end of the pole to the other. Aristotle saw this so well some 2,500 years ago in his Nicomachean Ethics. He talks about how a virtue is often a middle place between two extremes. And the classic illustration that he used was to talk about courage. He said, courage is a virtue, but it can be corrupted into a vice if you go to the right or to the left to an extreme of deficiency or excess. So what is a deficiency of courage? When you don't have enough courage, well, what do you call that? Well, of course, we call it cowardice. And what do you call it when you have too much courage, too much of this good thing? Well, we call that recklessness or rashness. And so this fundamental insight is applied in fairly often throughout virtually every aspect of human experience. And it's true in education. It's true culturally. For example, if parenting styles have been too strict, and we realize this, well, then we likely want to correct that strict, regressive parenting style with something that's more light and sympathetic, more permissive. And the temptation might be to move too far to the permissive end. Well, you can think about this in relationship to just about anything from dieting to exercise. Perhaps when the new year came around, you decided you were really going to pick up on exercise, and you could easily go from too little exercise to too much exercise and overdo it. How do we find that place that we would consider harmonious? Sometimes it's the intermediate middle between two vices. Sometimes that's the case. Maybe not always, but it's often the case. And I think this thought exercise from Aristotle, anyway, applies to education when we think about rigor in education. And one reason that I think it's important to think about rigor in education is precisely because standards have fallen so low. We've gotten soft educationally. When we compare what students had to do, say, in the late 1800s or early 1900s, we would look at the college examinations from those eras. Rarely could someone with a master's degree complete successfully those examinations, it seems, when we read them. So standards seem to have fallen. The bar has been lowered so low that we need to lift up the bar, ladies and gentlemen. Our students can climb higher. They can do more. They can be smarter. They can be faster. They can be stronger. So if education has become soft, well, then it's not surprising that there should be a movement to make it hard. And rigor is restoring standards to education, we might say. But can we overdo that? Now, think about it. When you consider a rigorous education, what comes to your mind? Certainly you want someone who is going to be flying your airplane to have had a rigorous education, would you not? I think when I hear the pilots speak when I'm on airplanes and when I see them in the cockpits going over checklists and getting ready, I think to myself, I think they've had a good, rigorous education. I hope they have. They're checking the list twice, etc., for my safety. Or if you're going in for surgery, I think you're hoping that your surgeon has had, a rigorous education and training. So rigorous can mean something positive, and it can be a corrective to something that we consider to be kind of soft and easy. We wouldn't want to hear our pilot saying something like, boy, my pilot training was so easy, I hardly had to do any work. Or our, heart surgeon saying, oh, my advanced training in heart surgery was so easy, I hardly ever had to come into the hospital. It was a breeze. So there's a place for thinking about rigor properly in education, but we can corrupt it. And so I want to address that too, because I think perhaps we have swung too far to the rigorous side. It's common to speak about the virtue of rigorous education right now. And from one perspective, I have no qualms with advocating for a rigorous education. But the phrase, rigorous education, is an equivocal one. What do we really mean when we say that we want a rigorous education for our children? I'm going to read to you now some excerpts from actual websites from actual classical schools. Here's what you can read on the home pages or the academic pages of several classical schools. Christ-centered and academically rigorous curriculum, grounded in the basic doctrine of the historic Christian faith. Here's another one. We believe our rigorous academic standards will easily meet the expectations of accrediting organizations. And here are two more. Our school seeks to train hearts and minds for the glory of God through rigorous curricula, character education, competitive athletics, fine and performing arts, and an array of extra and co-curricular activities. And finally, additionally, the academic philosophy, rigorous curriculum, and high educational standards in Catholic schools lead to a higher academic achievement, standardized test scores, and college acceptance rates. Note that these schools want readers of their website to know that they offer a rigorous classical education. So when we try, as these websites have to do, and I have to do regularly when I'm speaking and in giving podcasts like this, when we try to briefly describe something as complex as education, we are necessarily limited by the words we use. To call a curriculum classical, for example, on its own does not clearly and unequivocally communicate what the curriculum is. What do you think of when you hear the word classical? Well, it depends on who you are. To call a marriage or a family traditional suffers from the same ambiguity with the word traditional. These designations are more like the title of an essay or a book than a discrete definition. The same is true, for example, of a good red wine. How shall I describe this beautiful wine? It's full-bodied and robust. It's elegant and poised. It's expressive and dynamic. These are the kind of words we read about on the back of wine bottles. A good wine, however, is complex. It's a blend. I don't have any significant objections when someone calls a curriculum classical or rigorous any more than I do when someone might call his family traditional, as in most cases the context matters, or in the case of a website, more text. If a school website notes that the curriculum is rigorous, well, I don't have a great objection to that. But what else? What else does it say about the curriculum? How am I to understand the employment of a word like rigor as part of a multifaceted curriculum? Because a curriculum is a course of study, is it not? It's many things at once. It's teachers and students, it's books, it's experiences. It's a path that we're walking on. So what do we mean when we say rigor when it's part of a multifaceted curriculum? Is there any mention on the website of contemplation, wonder, delight, or rest? Or has rigor swallowed them whole? Even the school's website might not be sufficient, and an actual conversation with someone might be needed, or even better, a school visit. We need more information. We need context. In the larger context of falling standards in education and falling performance, I think it is justifiable for classical educators to note that their education and curriculum is rigorous. Rigor is a corrective counter to soft test prep education and social promotion. But rigor as the only response is not a sufficient response. And any good thing can be taken to an unintended extreme and thus corrupt it. And I think that's what's happened to several of these classical schools. They're good schools, good people doing good work. And without meaning to do it, sometimes some of them have gone to an extreme such that their curriculum is hard, rigorous, but hard for hardness' sake. In other words, hardness or rigor has kind of swallowed up other important aspects of what the curriculum should be. We've borrowed, by the way, the word rigor straight from Latin. In Latin, the word rigor means stiffness, hardness, strictness, and severity. Think of our word rigid, and think of the word, also from Latin, rigor mortis, the stiffness of death. In modern English, it's come to mean strictness, severity, or even inflexible precision. But again, context matters. When applied to education in that context, it typically refers to high standards of discipline, thoroughness, and challenge in thinking or learning, which is why when used properly in context in education, I don't have much of an objection. Because if we mean thoroughness, high standards of discipline, challenge in thinking and learning, I have no objection to that. But if it becomes severity and inflexible precision or hardness for hardness' sake, of course, I have an objection. I think this is what most classical schools mean, however, when they employ the word. They mean thoroughness, challenge in thinking, high standards of discipline. But the word rigor still does suffer from connotations of strictness, severity, and inflexible precision. Therefore, in my opinion, this word should be used carefully and in a fuller context of what constitutes a robust classical curriculum and pedagogy. If we're not careful, rigor becomes the privileged means of considering our curriculum to the exclusion of other virtues that we should also seek for the way that we teach and order our studies. If our curriculum is rigorous, is it mainly rigorous, or is it only rigorous? Is it also beautiful, good, and shot through with wonder? A good wine is usually a blend of several lovely elements, and I think that I would actually be tempted to buy a bottle of blended wine at the wine shop if it were labeled rigor and rest. Just as the Christian faith is at the same time energetic and forceful, but also meek and peace-loving, so is a human education both rigorous and restful, in a harmonious blend. The best marriage and the most healthy family also will be a blend that's hard to subject to, mere quantitative scientific analysis that renders a score. Imagine saying, my marriage this month fell to an 88 out of 100. I think that I would prefer to resort to words to describe my marriage on a good day and might call it something like elegant and poised, expressive and dynamic, or even bold and daring, like a good wine. Anything good is a harmony. Anything good is a blend. As many of us have been working to recover the classical tradition, we have indeed found some rigor, but also rest and wonder. The contemplative mode of learning and study has usually been present along with the active, energetic, and rigorous mode. Certainly this was the case for nearly 1,000 years in which monastic education was the main way people received a classical education throughout Europe. For example, the Benedictine order has as one of its mottos, ora et labora, which is pray and work. It's a blend. And another one of their mottos is simply pax, peace. Peace, too, is a blend. Peace does not mean the absence of order or even the absence of work, but it means a particular kind of ordered life in which there is ora et labora. Ora is prayer, it's contemplation, it's restful, it's communion with God, usually in the presence with others if it's corporate worship. And of course, labora is active work, energetic work. These two things can be blended for a full, harmonious life. And so should it be in a classical school, in a classical homeschool, with classical curriculum and classical pedagogy. We found in our study of the classical tradition of education, we found one indicator of the restful mode simply by tracing the etymology of school back to the word scholé. The Greek word scholé is the root for our English word school, as well as for the word school in many Romance languages, like escuela in Spanish, and scuola in Italian, and skul in German. As Plato and Aristotle used it, scholé means something like undistracted time to study the things most worthwhile, usually with one's friends, usually in a beautiful place, and often with good food and drink. In modern experience, there's not a lot of scholé in our schools. So I want to mention that I've thought a lot about this over the last 15 or 20 years with a lot of other people. Yes, we want the energetic, active mode of learning. We want, as it were, Martha from Luke 11 to be active in our schools. She was the one who was busy doing many things when Christ visited her home along with her sister Mary. And Mary, of course, was sitting with Christ during this time, having great discussion with him. Mary represents contemplative learning, restful learning, communion with Christ. And so we want Martha and Mary. And it's the basis of, this book by my friend and colleague Devin O'Donnell. I'm holding up a book for those of you listening. It's called The Age of Martha, A Call to Contemplative Learning in a Frenzied Culture. He takes this story of Christ visiting Martha and Mary as his departure point for reflecting on education. He subtitles his book, A Call to Contemplative Learning in a Frenzied Culture. Our culture is frenzied, and we do need some contemplation. And think of that word contemplation. It means to be in the temple, at least etymologically speaking, cum, templum. We need a sacred, set-apart place for study that's also the engagement of something wonderful, true, good, and beautiful. So rigor has its place too, but it's blended with a contemplative mode as well. So we want both Martha and Mary to be describing the way we learn. There's another book that was published, maybe 10 years ago now, called Teaching from Rest, A Homeschooler's Guide to Unshakable Peace by Sarah Mackenzie. She also reflects on the same passage, but on other things as well, seeking to return peace and rest to those of you who are homeschooling educators, seeking to restore really good education and even rigorous education in your homes. But she thinks that it needs to be done restfully and not in a frenzied way and not with great stress. So this book has really struck a chord with many who have taken on education at home. And then finally, I'll mention this book called The Scholé Way, Bringing Restful Teaching and Learning Back to School and Homeschool. For those listening, I'm holding up another book. This is a book that I finished just a couple of months ago after people would ask me over and over again, would you please write a small book about what it means to teach in this scholé restful mode? So there are 3 resources for you should you be interested, and I'll also direct your attention as I conclude to classicalu.com, where there's some courses on restful learning blended properly with rigorous learning for those of you who are teachers seeking to renew classical education in either your schools or homeschools. I've been gratified to see many people blending their wine well in classical schools and homeschools. There are increasing numbers of schools and homeschools blending their wine and offering both rigor and rest. This is Christopher Perrin with The Christopher Perrin Show. I want to thank you once again for watching or listening. I'd like to thank you for watching or listening to The Christopher Perrin Show. And to do that, I can give you a coupon code that will give you 10% off on anything that you might care to order at classicalacademicpress.com. And the coupon code is simply CP Show. Thanks again for listening or watching.